Evening to Parliament Street event around the defence capability of this country. As you can see, we have a distinguished panel. On my left here, we have Professor Eric Grove, who's from Salford University. He's a naval historian, and obviously he is a regular on the BBC and the like as a commentator, a deep well of knowledge there. Just next to my left, we have John Glenn MP. He's the Conservative member for Salisbury, and he's on the Defence Select Committee, which of course has its finger, we would hope, on the pulse of all of the issues around our defence capability. To my right, we have James Cleverly, who is Deputy Mayor of London, apparently, according to my notes. He's a former leader of the Conservative group in London. This is your second term, if I'm right, as our GLA member, very important and powerful role, but also, am I right in saying that you are former forces?
Yeah, former regular forces.
There you go, that's his excuse for being here. My excuse for being here is that they couldn't find anyone better. So firstly, let me apologise in advance for my inadequacies as a host. There will be blood, and I just want you to prepare yourself and accept that. The format will be 10 minutes from each of our panel members. Now, this is a housekeeping message to our panel members. You will ruthlessly be kept to your 10 minutes. So actually, it's 9 minutes and 59 seconds. Should you elongate your period, you will be lynched from behind by the chair. So when you wake up, you know what's happened. After that, we'll have a question and answer. The whole point of this is to have a free-flowing conversation from you. We really want questions. I want you to understand this is a test, and you will be graded on the quantity of questions and the quality of those questions. Should you want to tweet, it is Sean Bailey at Sean Bailey UK. At Sean Bailey UK. At Sean Bailey UK. But that way you can tweet your question in. Should you be too nervous to actually put your hand up in a room? But I would advise putting your hand up in a room because it'll add to the atmosphere. Can I just be brutal? This is not about so much an analysis of the problem as a tilt towards what we should do about the problem. What we're looking for here is policy solutions, not a whinge about what the problem is. So let me put this to you. If you were to speak for 30 seconds, 5 of your 30 seconds should be a whinge, 25 should be a very sharp, pointed question. Again, if that's not the case, you will be lynched by the chair. But without further ado, which one of you esteemed gentlemen would like to speak first?
As everybody looks at me. Okay, fine. All right, I will do it first. My problem, and I have a bit of a whinge, it may be a little bit more in proportion to my 10 minutes, is that I'm very disturbed at the way that our defence policy has been going in the last few years. At the risk of being lynched, I would say that in many respects, although it wasn't funded properly and defence policy was not managed correctly by the last government, the Strategic Defence Review of the late 90s was actually, I think, a pretty balanced and sensible assessment of Britain's capabilities. And of course, with my naval background, I would say that as it started the carrier programme, which I'm still a great fan. And I think it demonstrated that, as it was put, as we have to go to the conflict doesn't come to us. Of course, that was a slight misjudgment with terrorism, etc. But nonetheless, I think that the overall force posture, the overall balance, and it's balance, I think, is the word I want to emphasise, between the various armed forces, between the various capabilities, was, I think, fundamentally a good one. But the problem was it wasn't affordable. And we got into terrible financial difficulties, and of course the present government coalition has had to cope with those. But given the fact one was doing it on the basis of what I would regard as a very ill-advised war in Iraq, and I think a war which in Afghanistan, which was fought for something of the wrong reasons, you can probe me on that if you like, we have got now a very distorted defence posture. And with great respect to my khaki colleagues here, when you have a situation where the media automatically think of the army as the armed forces, and when you look at the balance between the army and the navy and the air force, I think personally, but perhaps I wouldn't I, but nonetheless, I think there is something seriously wrong. Hopefully, by 2020, well, for example, for the first time, we do not have dedicated maritime patrol aircraft since 1913. And oddly enough, Britain's an island surrounded by sea, water. And it can also, as was shown on several occasions in the 1940s, it can also be bombed. And it also requires air defences. You might be surprised at that. I'm the only naval historian I know who thinks creating the RAF was a good idea. But when you look at the foundations of Britain's security, which might well have implications for the kinds of forces that we need to offer to our coalition partners to engage in the expeditionary operations that will be necessary. And I think one of the things that worried me most about the SDSR was a very sensible national security strategy was coupled to a defence posture which didn't really relate to it. And quite publicly, I've said, both in print and on the electronic media, or the broadcast media, that I thought it wasn't very strategic, because it did not emphasise those forces which we require to give us the necessary flexibility and expeditionary capability. It got rid of the aircraft carriers. This morning, we hear that Ark Royal, which had the great privilege of being in when she was supporting British forces ashore in a very messy situation and doing what carriers can do best, being a national asset which could be used for British national interests if British forces ashore got into trouble. And John Major came out to the theatre and said one reason he said that forces were ashore was because he had the capacity, the national capacity, to provide air support without any reference to anyone else, should there be a problem ashore. And that, I think, that lesson was learned. Also, in the late 90s, Saddam Hussein helped the carrier argument by not doing what the outside world wanted, but nonetheless getting sufficient sympathy among the local Arab states that they wouldn't provide land bases for the aircraft that were being used to coerce him. And therefore carrier air power had to be used. And the British contribution was actually quite significant. One American carrier, one British carrier. And that happened during the SDR. And this, I think, had a considerable effect on what was a finely balanced argument about whether Britain should go ahead and build a new generation of aircraft carriers. And the decision went in favour of that because of experience. I often used to say to my students at Dartmouth and Greenwich that actually you could build up a whole series of heroes of the Royal Navy in the post-war period, those people who were demonstrating that maritime forces and maritime air forces were necessary. Kim Il-sung in the Korean War, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Suez, Sukarno, General Qasim, a previous Iraqi leader with the Kuwait operation. And persistently there would be these lessons that if you want to be able to intervene, or want to be able to threaten to intervene, or if you want to have the capacity to poise and for the government to make its mind up. I used to rather cruelly say, and it was cruel, and I take it back really, the John Major factor, allowing politicians the time to make their minds up by having forces in the area that can be used in a particular set of circumstances. But of course, we got trapped into a kind of new continentalism in the Middle East and into Afghanistan. And remember that part of the reason for the Afghan deployment from about 2005, 2006 onwards, if you read Cooper Coles, these are diplomats, so you can't lie, can he? When he says that in discussions with military leaders, they were saying, well, actually, we need this war to maintain our structure. And that, I think, is very telling. And it's been very successful. Afghanistan has been beautifully successful. It has kept the army in the manner to which it has become accustomed. Very successful. And if you think that's cynical, well, I'm old enough to be an old cynic. I've been studying defence policy that long. But therefore we need, and here's where we need to make sure that we get a better balance as we go forward. I think the plans for the greater use of reservists in the army to get more capability, hopefully for a more limited increase in expenditure, I think there's a lot to be said for that. Quite clearly, Britain needs ground forces. It needs ground forces that are rapidly deployable. It needs air deployable forces, and the current ones we have are very good. It needs maritime deployable forces, and the ones we have are very good, although they've been shrunk somewhat. You need mobile air power with its mobile bases, and hopefully by and in fact I very much supported the decision to go for the F-35B, short takeoff vertical landing aircraft, because it meant we would actually have an aircraft carrier with aircraft on it by 2018, 2019. Can you imagine, whatever party was in power, the political repercussions of Her Majesty whom God preserve, going up to Rosyth and launching or floating out HMS Queen Elizabeth. And that ship, HMS Queen Elizabeth, and that ship immediately going into reserve, into mothballs. Can you imagine finessing the politics of that? You know, some of you might have had to have done it. Now, that would be extremely difficult. And in fact, going for the F-35B, I found some of the figures a bit weird, but still, going for that I think does mean that we will have a necessary capability. We're going to buy 48 F-35Bs. That will be enough for a surge capability of 36 in each carrier. You cannot, in fact, seriously project power as a major actor with sufficient influence in the operation unless you have that kind of capability. So that is an investment, and confirming that investment perhaps to get even more aircraft and altering the balance of the Air Force in favour of a more maritime basing. How you work out the inter-service problems, well, perhaps we can talk about that later. But that, I think, is very important. Also replacing the increasingly old Type 23 frigates with the Type 26s, making sure we have a sufficiently powerful fighter force, because the Russians keep coming. They keep flying down, and we need fighters to deal with it. All I suppose I'm arguing for is that we need to start ordering our defence posture in a rather different way, realising that as an island what we fundamentally need to do is to control the seas around us and control the air above us. That's what allowed Britain to survive in 1914. And finally, we need a nuclear deterrent based on SLBMs in submarines. And on that point, I'll stop.
This evening, I'm John Glenn. I'm on the Defence Select Committee, and I have been the Member of Parliament for Salisbury since 2010. I think when I look at defence, and I've looked at it a lot in the last 2.25 years, one of the dominant issues is the gap that we have in the Conservative Party between the rhetoric and the reality. I mean, no proper Conservative really goes into politics wanting to cut defence budgets. It's against what we do, it's against our priority for looking after the national interest, and I think it was extremely difficult for us to go through that process leading up to the STSR in October 2010. But what I also find is that there's never a shortage of opinions over how that STSR was wrong at so many levels. The gap between the national security strategy narrative and what provision was in the STSR, the different decisions according to which heritage, which service people come from, about whether the right decision around aircraft carriers, all the rest of it, whether we got rid of the Nimrod in the right way or not, whether we actually allocated the right distribution of resources around the cuts going forward. And everyone believes they have the answer, because actually it's very plausible to argue from all of those things that Eric's touched upon that, well, that's not desirable, that's not desirable. I actually think that in the Secretary of State, Liam Fox, we had somebody who was pretty effective at arguing for a much reduced cut than had we anyone else in the post, and I think he did extremely well to limit the cuts to what we had. It's an inconvenient truth, but it's a truth nonetheless, that the dominant context for decision making for defence over the last 2.5 years has been the financial inheritance. And some of the decisions around the aircraft carrier, etc., were massively influenced. In fact, there really wasn't the discretion that was normally there as a governing power because of what decisions had been made before. And there wasn't really much room for manoeuvre, and that is the reality. And I defy anyone who criticises any single element of the STSR settlement to actually come up with a countermeasure within the same envelope. Because if we accept the premise that the dominant security threat to our country is the threat to our economy, then we have to make some cuts. And you've got to make them somewhere if you ring-fence so many other different things. The other point is that influence in a multipolar world comes not just from our defence posture, but also the relationship with diplomacy, with what the Foreign Office does, with our aid budget, and those three combine and work very effectively. I spent some time in Afghanistan, and what was absolutely clear is that each component of our activity there needs to work with the others, because actually if they don't, they will each be ineffective. But it's also not viable to adopt a defence posture and a foreign policy in isolation. I mean, all of our activities are frankly aligned to other countries' interests. And as a constituency MP, you always get individuals who say to you, well, why did we intervene in Libya in the way that we did, but we're not prepared to do the same thing in Syria? Mm-hmm. And of course, the reality is that defence and foreign policy is about reacting to events. It's about the reality of different diplomatic circumstances, different postures of Russia and China, different willingness to commit resources, and also a different level of practical likely outcomes. And all of those things contribute to a different context. And similarly, when people talk about the Arab Spring, what's the government's position on the Arab Spring? Well, I mean, each country in the Middle East has a very, very different set of dynamics, set of relationships, and we have a different understanding and set of levers to influence things. So I would just be a little bit cautious about drawing too quick a conclusion based on the headlines of the SDSR and the immediate decisions made, because of course there are some big risks that were inherent in some of those decisions. But frankly, when you haven't got the resources, you can't spend the money in the way that you wanted to. But what I'm absolutely clear about is that we need to recognise that the major and most dominant effect of living in a multipolar world is that there is an increased level of unpredictability. In the Cold War days, we could anticipate certain strategic alignments, we could develop a defence posture that met with those things, but that is no longer possible. And that's why it's absolutely important that we embed within the decision-making capability through the National Security Council and through the work of the Secretaries of State working together is a flexibility. And I think that one of the principles that the SDSR did try to embed in our military is an ability through extra use of the reserves is to actually scale up more quickly whilst having a core that will give us a basic capability for a certain set of events that we think are plausible. But that will change, and we need to have that, an eye to that flexibility. And I readily concede that some of the decisions that we made, are extremely difficult to justify on their own terms. I mean, the aircraft carrier decision was based more around the contractual arrangements that were bequeathed us. Eric said he found some of the figures a bit weird. Well, I certainly found some of the figures a bit weird, and I also find the different interpretation of some of the figures a bit weird. But I was talking to a very senior former officer who's now in the House of Lords, and he put it like this. He said, what we need to do is establish what the risks are facing our country, therefore from that work out what capabilities we need to develop, and that should inform the SDSR. And by the way, you need to make absolutely sure that you put extra resources into the army, because they're going to need it after Afghanistan. And therein lies the problem. The structure of our decision making is aligned around three services who are trained and culturally attuned at beyond a certain level to fight for their own interests, and not genuinely develop the tri-service view that's needed to optimise decision making. That to me is where some of the solutions and reforms need to come in and to develop further for us to adopt the right sort of solutions for the future. And with that kind end, I shall shut up. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
my starting point for this is that the SDSR has happened. Right or wrong, good or bad, it has happened, it can't unhappen. The Ark Royal's been decommissioned, it can't be undecommissioned. In fact, in the lead up to Libya, my understanding is, and I don't know whether this is necessarily true, someone from the MO, someone from government contacted someone from the Navy and said, how decommissioned is the Ark Royal? And the answer was, well, we're in the process of taking the engines out. And the person in government said, well, can you stop? And the person from the Royal Navy explained that when you take bits of engines out for reconditioning, you take them carefully bit by bit through hatches and doors. When you're decommissioning a ship, you oxyacetylene a hole in the side and you take it out with chains and pulleys. So no, you cannot undecommission the Ark Royal. So we are where we are. And so I'm actually, I'm not going to try and add much to what's already been discussed about the SDSR, because I think what we need to make is right or wrong. Typhoon has been commissioned, Ark Royal's been decommissioned, Stovall aircraft are being bought, they're not going to be unbought, etc., etc. So let's take a leap ahead of that and think where we're going next. So firstly, what is a unipolar or multipolar? Well, I had to look it up because I'm a bit knock when it comes to those kind of things. And what I work out is it means we don't know who the baddies are. We don't know who the baddies are going to be. And more importantly than that, we don't know how powerful the goodies are going to be, comparatively speaking. John mentioned that means the need to be flexible. The other thing that really strikes me is that recently we've been very focused on the war, and our defence posture has been very much geared around the war rather than a war. And if you talk to members of the armed forces who are in armoured regiments, tankies, they don't know how to do tank warfare anymore, because we haven't done flowing over rolling countryside, tank warfare for 10 years, which basically means that sergeants, troop sergeants in armoured regiments haven't been troopies in armoured regiments. They don't know how to fight their tanks. They haven't done it. Okay. Air defenders. We have not done ground-based air defence as an artillery officer. We have not done ground-based air defence in a very real context at any point between the Falklands and our most recent deployment, which has been around East London in supporting the Olympics. We haven't done air defence where the enemy has actually got aircraft in a whole generation. There are big bits of military capability that we just have not done. So the big question that I ask is, what are we going to do? Are we going to try and present ourselves as a complete spectrum defence posture? And what I mean by that is, are we going to have SAS at one end of the spectrum and armoured divisions at the other end of the spectrum and all points in between? Are we going to have counter-piracy naval operations in the Horn of Africa at one end of the spectrum and expeditionary warfare with aircraft carriers and landing craft at the other end of the spectrum and all points in between? Do we have enough money to cover all those bases? Or should we, moving forward, accept the fact that our armed forces are not going to be big enough to tick every box? And should we perhaps focus on the areas that we are very good at, world class at, internationally recognised as being ahead of the game? So so for me, that demands certain questions. And seeing as we're in a think tank environment, let's be radical. Let's ask some really, really big questions. What's our appetite for destruction? How comfortable are we at killing people? Because that's what armed forces do. And as much as we like to kind of flounce around the edges, basically the thing that sets armed forces apart from everyone else in society is the willingness and capability to kill humans. That's what it is about. And if you ever lose sight of that fact, you're in trouble. So what is our appetite for killing people? The job that I do in the armed forces is in what's now known as the Joint Effects Desk. It used to be called the Guns Desk back when the Royal Artillery blew people up. That's what we used to do. In the modern theatre, and what the Joint Effects Desk mainly does in theatre is avoid blowing people up. Actually, we blow up things, we blow up buildings if we have to. We surgically remove particular high-profile and dangerous individuals, we mainly don't blow things up. Okay? Because our national appetite for blowing things up has greatly diminished. So we talk about the need for a nuclear deterrent. Are we really psychologically ready for blowing up not just 1 or 2 people, or 10s or 20s of people, or hundreds of people, or even thousands of people? Are we really in the mood for blowing up millions of people? Because that's what a nuclear defence posture means. We have to be psychologically ready and be prepared to destroy thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of lives. And if we're not prepared to do that, a nuclear deterrent is a bit of a waste of money. Are we prepared to lose large numbers of our own soldiers, sailors and airmen? Okay? If not, a large-scale state-to-state conflict is really not on the cards. If we are going to go to war with, let's pick a major emerging power at random, China, they have got the capability of putting an awful lot of manpower into the meat grinder in order to win. Okay? Are we willing to trade lives on a 1-to-10 ratio? Because if they are, and we're not, then we've lost, and there is little point in engaging in the conflict, because they are able to lose 10 people for each one of ours and still come out winners, because that's the scale of their army. And if we're not willing to do that kind of like mathematics, then again, we just need to, quite simply, not go to war with China. What's our appetite for putting humans in the front of aircraft? Okay, if we can bomb insurgents in northern Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan from a comfy desk in Arlington, Virginia, why are we really spending that much money putting humans in the front of aircraft? So there are some really big questions, some almost philosophical questions, and until we get our head around those philosophical questions, our defence posture is going to be cluttered. And the big thing, and it's been hinted at by the other 2 speakers in their speeches, is that really we've got to ask ourselves, do we need to have 3 separate armed services and the hierarchies that go with them? We have an aircraft, recently commissioned aircraft, that does not fly off our recently commissioned aircraft carriers. We have got conflicting purchasing decisions, and we have a military procurement strategy which is all over the place. So perhaps one of the really bold questions we need to ask is it now time to scrap the Army, Navy and RAF and just have a single defence force with a unified plan and a unified procurement? I'm not saying that's necessarily where I would go, because I'm a soldier. If it was down to me, we'd have the army and everyone else can get stuff.
Thank you.